June 6th, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. On one side of the English Channel, 34,000 American soldiers are packed into landing craft, engines screaming, heading toward a beach called Omaha. The men inside can't see the shore yet. They can only hear it. The distant thunder of naval guns, the shriek of aircraft overhead, and underneath all of it, the low groan of the ocean pushing their boats forward through 3-foot swells. Some men are vomiting from the diesel fumes and the motion. Some are praying. Some are completely silent, staring at the gray steel ramp in front of them, knowing that when it drops, they will have to run directly into whatever is waiting on the other side. Most of them are in their late teens or early 20s. Most of them have never seen combat. Most of them have been told that the German defenses will be softened by the time they land, that naval bombardment and airstrikes will have done the hard work, and that what's left will be manageable. They have been told wrong. On the other side of the channel, 900 kilometers away, in a quiet house in the town of Herlingen, Germany, a field marshal named Erwin Rommel is asleep. He went to bed the night before believing he had time. His meteorologists had reviewed the weather data and issued their assessment. The storm over the English Channel made any large-scale invasion impossible for at least another week. The waves were too high. The visibility was too low. No commander in his right mind would send men across that water in these conditions. They were wrong, too. What neither Rommel nor his meteorologist knew was that an Allied weather officer named Group Captain James Stagg had spotted something in the storm data that everyone else had missed. A narrow gap. Approximately 36 hours of acceptable conditions. Not good conditions, not ideal conditions, but enough. Enough for 5,000 ships. Enough for 13,000 aircraft. Enough for 156,000 men. Eisenhower had made the call on the evening of June 5th. One word, go. And now 34,000 Americans were heading toward Omaha Beach, and the man who had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment was asleep in Germany, 900 kilometers away. Here is what makes this story unlike any other D-Day story you have heard. Rommel knew this was coming. Not in a vague, general sense. Not a soldier's intuition about where the enemy might strike. He had written it down, months earlier, in precise detail. The location, the timing, what would happen to the first Americans who hit the beach in the opening minutes. What Germany needed to do to stop it. And, in language that reads almost like prophecy, exactly what would happen to those American soldiers if Germany failed to act on what he knew. He was right about all of it, every word. And because the wrong people ignored him, because a debate in a French chateau ended in a compromise that satisfied no one, the men in those landing craft paid for it in a currency that has only one denomination. This is the story of Erwin Rommel and the defense of Normandy. But it is also the story of John Barnes, 20 years old, from Virginia, standing in chest-deep water on Omaha Beach at 6:31 in the morning, watching the men in front of him fall. It is the story of Captain Joseph Dawson climbing a bluff that military planners said couldn't be climbed. It is the story of Sergeant John Ellery, crouched behind a concrete seawall, watching strangers become soldiers in real time. It is, above all, the story of what happens when one man sees the truth with perfect clarity, and the world pays the price for not listening to him. Remember that name, Erwin Rommel, because by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly why the men on Omaha Beach, the men who may have been your grandfather, the face in the old photograph on your family's wall, owed both their survival and their suffering to a German general sleeping 900 kilometers away. Before we follow those men onto the beach, you need to understand who Erwin Rommel was. Because the soldiers climbing out of those landing craft weren't facing an ordinary commander. They weren't facing a bureaucrat in a uniform, a political appointment, a man who had earned his rank by outlasting his rivals. They were facing the most dangerous military mind the German army had produced in a generation, and possibly the one man on earth who understood exactly what was about to happen on that beach better than anyone on either side. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in the town of Heidenheim in southwestern Germany. His father was a schoolteacher. His family was middle class, educated, unremarkable. There was nothing in his background that predicted what he would become. He was not from a military dynasty. He had no aristocratic connections. He was not the right kind of person to rise very far. He rose anyway. He rose because of a quality that cannot be taught in any military academy, an almost supernatural instinct for the shape of a battle while it was still happening. Not after the fact, not from a map 20 miles behind the lines. In the middle of it, under fire, with incomplete information and no time to think, Rommel could see what was happening, what was about to happen, and what needed to be done before anyone around him had processed the situation at all. His performance in the First World War was extraordinary enough that it became the subject of a military textbook he published in 1937, called Infantry Attacks, studied by officers on both sides of the Second World War, including, reportedly, George Patton, who kept a copy. In one engagement in October 1917, during the Battle of Caporetto in Italy, Rommel's small mountain unit captured 9,000 Italian prisoners and 81 artillery pieces in a single day. He was 26 years old. By the time the Second World War began, Rommel was one of the most respected tactical commanders in the German military. But he was still not considered an insider. He lacked the social credentials of the Prussian aristocrats who dominated the high command. He was too aggressive, too unconventional, too willing to ignore the established ways of doing things. Senior officers found him difficult. He found them slow. What changed his career and his place in history was North Africa. In February 1941, Hitler sent Rommel to Libya with a small German force called the Afrika Korps. The mission was limited: stabilize the Italian position, hold the line, don't lose ground. Rommel looked at the situation, ignored his orders, and attacked. Within weeks, he had driven British forces back across hundreds of miles of desert. He had done it with inferior numbers, insufficient fuel, unreliable supply lines, and equipment that was in many respects worse than what the British were using. He had done it through speed, deception, and an ability to make decisions faster than his opponents could react. The British press named him the Desert Fox. Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and said, "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and, may I say across the havoc of war, a great general." His own generals were furious. Churchill didn't care. Rommel had earned it. What the nickname obscured was something more important than tactical brilliance. Rommel was a student of war, a man who thought constantly about why battles were won and lost, where the leverage points were. He did not just fight. He analyzed, he argued, he wrote it down. And in the winter of 1943, when he flew to France to inspect the defenses of Western Europe, he brought all of that with him. He looked at Hitler's Atlantic Wall and saw immediately, with the same instinct that had made him dangerous at 26, exactly what was wrong, exactly what was missing, and exactly what would happen to every American soldier coming ashore if Germany failed to act. The Atlantic Wall. Hitler called it the greatest defensive fortification in human history. In his speeches, it was impenetrable. A continuous chain of steel and concrete stretching 2,700 kilometers from Norway to the Spanish border, manned by battle-hardened troops armed with artillery that could reach any ship foolish enough to approach. In his propaganda films, it looked exactly like that. Massive bunkers, rows of guns pointing out to sea, an iron coastline that no invasion force on Earth could crack. Rommel arrived in France in December 1943 to begin his inspection. He had been appointed commander of Army Group B, responsible for the coastline most likely to face an Allied landing. He traveled with a small staff, moving from sector to sector, inspecting every position, talking to local commanders, reviewing every plan put in place over 2 years of construction. What he found was not the Atlantic Wall of Hitler's speeches. What he found was a bluff. Stretches of coastline with no defenses at all, just open beach and a handful of men placed there because someone needed to put someone somewhere. Bunkers under construction for 2 years, still unfinished. Artillery positions with guns dating to the First World War, some unable to traverse far enough to cover the beaches they were supposed to protect. Minefields that existed on paper, but not in the ground. Entire sections of the Normandy coast where an assault force could come ashore and meet nothing. And the men. Rommel looked at the troops assigned to these positions and understood immediately they were not the veterans of Hitler's speeches. Many were older soldiers pulled from the Eastern Front after being wounded, men who had fought hard but were no longer fit for Russia. Some units consisted of troops from Soviet Central Asia who had surrendered to the Germans and been given a choice between a prison camp and a German uniform. Their loyalty was uncertain, their training was minimal, their equipment was whatever remained after the better divisions had taken what they needed. Rommel wrote to his superiors in language that was, for a German officer in 1943, almost shockingly blunt. "I have looked at the Atlantic Wall," he wrote, "and I can only say that it is an enormous bluff, not just for the enemy, but for the German people as well." He did not stop at criticism. He immediately began to fix what he could. Over the 3 months that followed, Rommel drove his engineers and commanders with an intensity that left his staff exhausted. He ordered the installation of approximately 6.5 million mines along the French coastline, placed in calculated patterns to channel landing craft into kill zones and force infantry onto ground pre-targeted by German artillery. He ordered wooden stakes driven into open fields behind the beaches, tall enough and dense enough to destroy any glider attempting to land. Allied intelligence officers who spotted them in reconnaissance photographs called them Rommel's asparagus. Most critically, he redesigned the beach obstacles. The existing obstacles sat above the waterline, visible at low tide, easy to navigate around. Rommel understood immediately this was backwards. Obstacles needed to be at the waterline or below it, invisible to landing craft approaching at high tide, positioned so boats would drive onto them before their ramps dropped. Steel hedgehogs welded from railroad track, wooden stakes with mines on their tips, curved steel ramps designed to flip a landing craft at speed. He was building a trap. A specific, carefully engineered trap designed for the exact boats, the exact assault tactics, and the exact soldiers who would one day be coming ashore. He had spent 2 years in North Africa learning precisely how the British and Americans fought. He knew their doctrine. He knew their equipment. He knew that when they landed, they would come at high tide, in flat-bottom boats, in waves. And he had built every obstacle with that specific image in mind. He knew they were coming. The only questions were, where and when? And Rommel, alone among Germany's senior commanders, had a very clear answer to the first one. The question of where the Allies would land was, in the spring of 1944, the single most important intelligence problem in the entire war. Get it right, and Germany could concentrate its forces, build its defenses, and have a real chance of throwing the invasion back into the sea. Get it wrong, and the men and guns would be in the wrong place, and once the Allies were ashore in strength, there would be no second chance to fix the mistake. German intelligence had an answer. The landing would come at Pas de Calais. The logic was straightforward. Pas de Calais was the narrowest point of the English Channel, just 33 kilometers of water separating the English coast near Dover from the French coast near Calais. It offered the shortest crossing, the best port access, and the most direct route into the industrial heartland of Germany. It was where any rational commander would land an invasion force. It was where the German High Command had concentrated the bulk of its defensive strength. And it was where Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, remained absolutely convinced the blow would fall. There was only one significant problem with this assessment. It was wrong. The Allies were not coming to Pas de Calais. They were coming to Normandy, a stretch of coastline in northern France, 300 kilometers to the southwest, chosen precisely because the Germans didn't expect it. The beaches were accessible, the terrain behind them, while difficult, was manageable, and the distance from England, while greater than Calais, was within the operational range of Allied fighter cover. The Allies had also spent months making absolutely certain the Germans kept looking at Pas de Calais. Operation Fortitude was the most elaborate military deception in history. Fake army groups with real radio traffic, broadcasting the kind of routine administrative chatter that German signals intelligence had learned to trust. Inflatable tanks and trucks placed in fields visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. Carefully controlled leaks through double agents who had been feeding the German intelligence service accurate information for years, and who were now feeding it the specific false information the Allies needed the Germans to believe. Most importantly, General George Patton, the one American commander the Germans genuinely feared, was publicly appointed to command the fictional 1st United States Army Group, the force supposedly massing in southeastern England for the strike at Pas de Calais. German intelligence tracked his movements, intercepted his communications, and concluded that, wherever Patton was going, that was where the main blow would fall. It worked perfectly. And it worked in part because it confirmed what the Germans already believed. Confirmation bias is not a modern discovery. Senior commanders in 1944, like senior commanders in every era, found it far easier to accept intelligence that matched their existing assumptions than intelligence that challenged them. Rommel was not entirely convinced. He had looked at the Normandy coastline. He had studied the beach gradients, the tidal patterns, the terrain behind the dunes. He had looked at where the Allied air attacks were hitting, the bridges, the rail lines, the road junctions, and noticed that the pattern of destruction was centered not on the approaches to Pas de Calais, but on the transportation network behind Normandy. He could not say with certainty. The deception was too good, the evidence too carefully constructed. But he believed Normandy was the real target. And he argued for strengthening its defenses with an urgency that his superiors found excessive. He was right. But being right was not enough. Because the argument that would determine whether his preparations actually mattered was not about where the Allies were landing. It was about what Germany was going to do in the first hours after they hit the beach. And on that question, Rommel was facing an opponent almost as formidable as the Allied forces themselves. His name was Gerd von Rundstedt, and he disagreed with Rommel about almost everything that mattered. Gerd von Rundstedt was 68 years old in the spring of 1944, and he had been fighting wars since before Rommel was a teenager. He was Prussian aristocracy in the truest sense. Old family, old money, old values, old ways of thinking about war. He had commanded armies in Poland in 1939. He had planned the breakthrough at Sedan in 1940 that broke the French front and sent the British Army running for the beaches at Dunkirk. He had led Army Group South deep into the Soviet Union in 1941. By almost any measure of experience and seniority, he was the most accomplished operational commander in the German military. He was also, on the specific question of how to stop the Allied invasion, completely wrong. Von Rundstedt's argument was built on a principle that had served European armies for generations: the mobile reserve. You did not try to hold every point of a long defensive line with equal strength. That was a recipe for being thin everywhere and strong nowhere. Instead, you held the line lightly, absorbed the initial enemy thrust, identified where the real blow was falling, and then hit back with a concentrated reserve held back precisely for this moment. You let the enemy commit. You let him show you his intentions. And then you crushed him. Von Rundstedt's plan: let the Allies land. Let them establish their beachhead. The coastline was too long to defend everywhere, over 3,000 kilometers from Norway to Spain. Better to hold back the Panzer Reserve, Germany's elite armored divisions in central France, and deploy them in a massive, concentrated counterattack once the Allied main effort had revealed itself. Drive them back into the sea before they could consolidate. End the invasion within days. It had worked in 1940 against France. Rommel had watched what Allied air power did to German armored formations in North Africa. He had seen it again in Italy. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had lived through it on the losing end, exactly what would happen when German panzer columns tried to move toward a beachhead in broad daylight with the Allies controlling the sky above them. By the spring of 1944, the Allied air forces were flying more than 14,000 sorties per day over Western Europe. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 300 serviceable fighters in all of France. The ratio was not a tactical disadvantage. It was annihilation. Any German armored column that moved in daylight would be spotted within minutes and attacked within minutes more. The P-47 Thunderbolts and the British Typhoons, aircraft that had spent 2 years learning in North Africa and Italy exactly how to kill a tank column on a road, would be on them before they had covered 10 kilometers. The vehicles would burn. The men inside them would die. The road would be blocked. Von Rundstedt's counterattack would never happen. The panzers would be destroyed before they reached the beach. The beachhead would grow undisturbed while the rescue force smoldered 50 kilometers away. Rommel had seen this movie before. He knew exactly how it ended. His argument was the opposite in almost every particular. Do not hold the panzers back. Station them at the coast, within immediate striking distance of every likely landing beach. Hit the Allies the moment they come ashore. In the water if possible. On the sand if necessary. In the first hour, before they can bring their full weight of firepower to bear. Before the fighter bombers establish a pattern over the beach. Before the supply ships begin unloading. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, he said. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day. If Germany could not throw the Allies back in those first 24 hours, the industrial and manpower advantages of the Allied coalition would grind the outcome to its inevitable conclusion. Kill them on the beach, or lose the war. That was Rommel's position. Stated clearly, argued relentlessly, committed to paper. And the man above him had no intention of agreeing. The argument between Rommel and von Rundstedt went all the way to Hitler. Hitler listened to both arguments. He understood the logic of each position. And he did what he so often did when presented with a genuine conflict between two of his best commanders. He compromised. In the worst possible way. Some panzer divisions were moved to the coast, satisfying Rommel's demand for forward deployment. But Hitler kept personal control of the three most powerful armored formations, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, and the 1st SS Panzer Corps. These units, the sharpest edge of Germany's armored strength in the West, could not be moved without a direct order from Hitler himself. Not from von Rundstedt. Not from Rommel. From Hitler. Rommel grasped the implication immediately. If the invasion came, when the invasion came, and those reserves were needed at the beach, someone would have to find Hitler, brief him on the situation, explain why the reserves needed to move and where they needed to go, and then wait for authorization. In normal circumstances, that process might take hours. Hitler was not always available. He kept unusual hours. He did not like being woken. His staff protected his sleep with a devotion that, in the crisis of June 6th, would prove catastrophic. In the hours when everything would be decided, the tanks would be waiting for a phone call. Rommel argued against this arrangement with everything he had. He requested a personal meeting with Hitler to make the case one final time. He wrote memoranda. He had his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, relay his concerns through every available channel. The answer was always the same. Hitler's decision was final. The reserve would remain under central control. What made this more than a bureaucratic frustration was the specific nature of the units being withheld. The Panzer-Lehr Division was arguably the best equipped armored formation in the entire German military. Its vehicles were newer, its crews were better trained, its maintenance standards were higher than any comparable unit. The 12th SS Panzer Division, composed largely of fanatical young volunteers from the Hitler Youth, was ferocious in combat and had proven itself on the Eastern Front. These were not second-line formations. These were the units Rommel needed most urgently, positioned furthest from where he needed them. The geography made it worse. The Panzer-Lehr was stationed near Chartres, more than 150 kilometers from the Normandy coast. The 12th SS was near Lisieux, somewhat closer, but still too far to reach the beach in the critical opening hours. Moving them in daylight was suicidal given Allied air superiority. Moving them at night was slow, vulnerable to breakdowns, and still subject to air attack at the bridges and road junctions that Allied bombers had been systematically destroying for months. Rommel had been asking for these divisions since December. He had been told, over and over, that the decision was Hitler's to make, and Hitler had made it. And so, in the spring of 1944, Germany's defensive posture in Normandy was neither Rommel's plan nor von Rundstedt's plan. It was a hybrid that satisfied neither man, forward enough to look like Rommel's approach, centralized enough to preserve Hitler's control, and fundamentally incapable of doing what either strategy actually required. The Americans who would storm Omaha Beach on June 6th had no way of knowing any of this. They did not know about the argument in the French chateau. They did not know that the tanks which might have destroyed them were sitting in fields 150 kilometers away, waiting for authorization that would come too late. They did not know that the man who had designed the defenses they were about to run into had lost the argument about how to use them. They only knew what they could see: the gray water, the gray sky, the gray steel ramp in front of them, and then the ramp dropped. June 5th, 1944. Late evening. Two worlds, separated by 900 kilometers of road and one catastrophic miscalculation. In the town of Herlingen, Germany, Erwin Rommel is at home for the first time in months. He is here for two reasons: to see his wife Lucy on her birthday, which falls on June 6th, and to travel to Berchtesgaden for a personal meeting with Hitler. One final attempt to argue for the release of the Panzer Reserve to his direct command. He has brought her shoes, ordered from a Paris shop, collected on his way south. They are on the kitchen table. His meteorologists have told him the weather in the channel is impossible. Force 6 winds, heavy cloud cover, swells that would swamp a landing craft. No invasion fleet commander with any sense would order men into that water. Not tonight, not tomorrow, probably not for another week. Rommel believes them. He goes to bed. In the English Channel, 5,000 ships are moving through the darkness. On one of them, the USS Samuel Chase, a Coast Guard attack transport, Private First Class John Barnes of the 116th Infantry Regiment is not sleeping. Barnes is 20 years old, from the town of Roanoke, Virginia. He has been in the Army for 14 months. He has never been in combat. He is sitting on a bench in the hold of the ship with the other men of Company A, waiting. The ship is pitching in the swells. The air smells of diesel and vomit. His equipment weighs 68 pounds. Rifle, ammunition, gas mask, rations, first aid kit, and the specific tools of his assignment, which involves demolition work on the beach obstacles. Around him, the men of Company A are doing what soldiers have always done in the hours before a battle. Some are talking quietly, the kind of conversation that is really just sound. Words to fill the silence, to keep the mind from going to the places it shouldn't go. Some are sleeping. Some are writing letters. Barnes is thinking about the briefing 2 days ago. The beach had been described as difficult but manageable. The German defenses had been mapped, the bunkers were known, the machine gun positions had been identified. Naval gunfire and air bombardment would suppress them before the landing craft hit the beach. The men of the first wave would face resistance, but it would be degraded resistance, shaken defenders in damaged positions, not the full weight of an intact German defensive line. Barnes does not know that the air bombardment scheduled for Omaha Beach will be delivered in overcast conditions by crews under orders not to risk bombing their own landing craft, and that the bombs will fall nearly 3 kilometers inland, missing the beach entirely, hitting empty fields, leaving the German bunkers untouched. He does not know that the naval gunfire, while ferocious and sustained, will be delivered at angles and distances that make direct hits on the concrete bunkers nearly impossible. He does not know that the German 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength, combat-experienced formation that American intelligence has not placed at Omaha Beach, has been conducting defense exercises in that exact sector for the past 3 weeks and is manning those bunkers at full strength. He does not know that Rommel designed those positions himself, that the angles of fire, the placement of the obstacles, the interlocking fields of machine gun coverage, all of it reflects months of thinking by the one man who understood most clearly how the Americans would come ashore and what would happen to them when they did. Barnes checks his rifle. He checks it again. Outside the hull of the ship, the channel is dark and loud with wind. At 0400 hours, the order comes to move to the boat deck and man the landing craft. Barnes stands up, adjusts the straps of his equipment, and follows the man in front of him up the ladder toward the open deck and the cold night air. He is 20 years old. He is from Virginia. His name is John Barnes. Remember that name. 0615 hours, June 6, 1944. Dog Green Sector, Omaha Beach. The ramp drops. What happens in the next 30 seconds will be studied in military academies for the rest of the century. But in the moment itself, in the 30 seconds after the ramp drops on John Barnes's landing craft at Dog Green Sector, there is no analysis. There is only chaos and noise and the cold shock of water and the sound of the MG-42s opening up from the bluffs above the beach. The MG-42, Germany's general-purpose machine gun, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that American soldiers described its sound not as individual shots, but as a tearing, like fabric being ripped at speed. Rommel had specified exactly where those guns should be placed, not facing straight out to sea, where the armor plating on the bow of a landing craft might offer some protection to the men inside. Angled, firing down the length of the beach so that a single burst could travel the full width of a landing zone, so that there was no safe angle of approach, no piece of ground that wasn't covered by at least 2 interlocking fields of fire. The men of Company A, 116th Infantry, had been assigned to Dog Green Sector, a 500-meter stretch of beach at the western end of Omaha, directly below a German strongpoint called WN-72. It was one of the most heavily defended positions on the entire Norman coastline. The planning documents had identified it as such. The men had been told it would be suppressed before they landed. It was not suppressed. Of the approximately 200 men who came ashore at Dog Green in the first wave, an estimated 190 became casualties within the first 30 minutes. Officers were killed before their feet touched dry sand. Sergeants who tried to rally their men were cut down before they could finish a sentence. Men who made it to the waterline found no cover. Rommel's obstacles were behind them in the surf, and ahead of them was 300 meters of open beach sloping upward toward the German positions. Barnes went into the water when the ramp dropped. The man in front of him was hit and fell back. Barnes stepped over him and went in. Chest-deep water, equipment dragging him down. He made it to the sand. What he found there was not the manageable resistance of the planning briefings. It was a vision he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe, and never quite succeeding. Bodies in the surf, rolling in the waves, men crawling up the beach with wounds that should have stopped them but hadn't, because the alternative was the water. landing craft burning offshore, the air so thick with the sound of incoming fire that individual shots were indistinguishable, just a continuous roar, punctuated by explosions, underneath which men were somehow still moving, still trying to do what they had been sent here to do. Barnes reached the shingle, a narrow bank of small stones at the base of the bluff, the first real cover on the beach, and pressed himself flat. Around him were men he had never met. His unit had been scattered. His officers were gone. He did not know where he was relative to his objective. He did not know what to do next. He was not alone in this. Along the entire length of Omaha Beach, the American assault was in crisis. The careful planning, the detailed maps, the rehearsed assignments, all of it had been shredded in the first minutes of contact, with a defense that was exactly as lethal as Rommel had designed it to be, and nothing like what the Americans had been told to expect. Omaha was the beach Rommel had reinforced most deliberately. His predictions were being confirmed with terrible precision. At 700 hours, a senior American naval officer observing the situation at Omaha sent a message back to Fleet Headquarters. It read, "Entire first wave foundered." The invasion of Europe's most fortified coastline was, in its opening hour, failing. And 900 kilometers away, Erwin Rommel's phone was about to ring. The call came at 6:15. Rommel's aide, Captain Helmut Lang, took it in the hallway outside the bedroom. The report was fragmentary. Paratroopers landing overnight across a wide area. Reports of a large naval force offshore fighting near the mouth of the Orne River. Lang knocked on Rommel's door and delivered the news. Rommel was dressed and downstairs within 15 minutes. He stood in the hallway and listened. The more he heard, the clearer it became. This was the invasion. This was the day he had been preparing for since December. The day he had argued about, pleaded about, written memoranda about. The day he had told his superiors would decide everything. That the first 24 hours would be the longest day, and that if Germany could not throw the Allies back in those 24 hours, the war in the West was over. The day was here, and he was 900 kilometers away. He was in his car and moving within the hour, heading north and west toward France. His driver pushed the Mercedes as fast as the roads would allow. Rommel sat in the back with his maps and his radio, listening to the reports as they came in, watching the picture develop with the trained eye of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read a battlefield. What he was reading was catastrophe. Not on the beaches. On the beaches, the picture was confused. Chaotic reports from multiple sectors, some encouraging, some alarming, all incomplete. But Rommel was not looking at the beaches. He was looking at the reserves. He was asking where the panzer divisions were. He was asking when they had been authorized to move. The answer came back in pieces, each piece worse than the last. The 12th SS Panzer Division? No movement orders. The Panzer Lehr? No movement orders. The 1st SS Panzer Corps? Still waiting. The request to release the reserves had gone up the chain of command in the early morning hours. Von Rundstedt had asked Hitler's headquarters to authorize the movement. Hitler was asleep. His staff had not woken him. Rommel absorbed this information in silence. He had known this was possible. He had argued against exactly this arrangement, the central control, the requirement for Hitler's personal authorization, the dangerous gap between when the reserves would be needed and when an authorization process, beginning with a sleeping dictator, could produce an order to move. Now those hours were passing. At 1,000 hours, Hitler woke at his residence in Berchtesgaden. He was briefed on the situation. He had been told, and believed, that the Normandy landing was a large-scale diversion designed to draw German reserves away from the real blow, which would fall at Pas-de-Calais. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception, had done its work too well. The most elaborate lie in military history was still being believed in the German High Command on the morning it mattered most. Hitler did not immediately release the Panzer Reserve. He reviewed the intelligence picture. The Panzer divisions sat in their fields. On Omaha Beach, 3 hours had passed since the first Americans hit the sand. The beach was still contested, still murderous, still the chaotic killing ground that Rommel's defenses had been designed to create. But it was not being thrown back. The Americans kept coming. Wave after wave, pouring onto the sand, stepping over their dead, pressing forward with a stubbornness that no defensive plan, however well designed, had fully accounted for. Something was happening on that beach that Rommel had not predicted. Not the casualties. He had predicted those with horrible accuracy. Not the chaos. He had anticipated that too. What he had not accounted for was what American soldiers did when the plan was gone, and only one decision remained: stay flat or get up. They got up. Not all of them, not at once, but enough. One by one, in small groups, along that terrible beach, American soldiers began to move. Captain Joseph Dawson of G Company, 1st Infantry Division, found a gap. Not in the German defenses, those were intact. A gap in the bluff itself. A fold in the terrain, a shallow draw running up the cliff face at an angle slightly less exposed than the open ground on either side. Dawson had 12 men. He looked at the draw and started climbing. They made it. At approximately 0800 hours, Dawson became the first American officer to reach the high ground above Omaha. He looked back down at what they had climbed out of. Bodies in the surf, burning landing craft, men still pinned on the sand. Then turned and led his 12 men toward the German positions on the bluff. 12 men against a fortified line. They attacked anyway. This is what Rommel's planning had not accounted for. His defenses were designed to stop a force that behaved according to military logic, that would break when casualties reached a certain level, fall back when command was destroyed, recognize an untenable position, and act accordingly. By those standards, the defenses were working. The American assault had suffered catastrophic losses. Its command structure was shattered. Its position was, by any rational calculation, untenable. The Americans did not act accordingly. Along Omaha Beach, small groups of men began doing what Dawson had done, finding gaps no planning document had identified. A sergeant leading strangers from 3 different companies. A private leading a squad because the officers were dead and someone had to go first. Shattered units collecting whoever was nearest and moving. It was not orderly. It was not according to plan, but it was moving forward. And forward movement through multiple points simultaneously was the one thing the German line had not been designed to survive. By 1,000 hours, American soldiers were on top of the bluffs at multiple points along Omaha Beach. The German positions were being attacked from behind. The machine gun nests that had devastated the first waves were being silenced one by one, not by naval gunfire or airstrikes, but by infantrymen with rifles and grenades, working their way along the top of the cliff toward positions they could now reach from the rear. The panzers that might have ended it, the armored reserve that Rommel had pleaded for, that Hitler had withheld, that had sat in fields 150 kilometers away while the critical hours passed, finally received their movement orders in the early afternoon. By then, daylight movement was suicidal. They moved at night, through bombed roads and broken bridges, arriving on June 7th. The beachhead was 24 hours old. Rommel reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon in the late evening of June 6th. He reviewed the situation maps in silence. Then he sat down and wrote in his diary. "We failed to throw them back on the first day," he wrote. "And I always said, if we cannot do it on the first day, we will not be able to do it at all." He was right. He had always been right. About all of it. 9,387 Americans are buried in the cemetery above Omaha Beach. They are there because of decisions made in a French chateau, because of a compromise that satisfied no one, because a dictator would not release his tanks. Rommel was not a hero. He served a criminal regime and built the defenses that killed those men. History is not simple, and neither was he. But he was right. And in war and being ignored is its own kind of tragedy. Because it is never the man who was right who pays the price. Remember the shoes on the kitchen table. Remember the ramp dropping at Dog Green. Remember Captain Dawson's 12 men climbing a bluff that wasn't supposed to be climbable. Remember the panzers sitting in their fields, waiting for a phone call while the hours ran out. And remember what Rommel wrote on the night of June 6th, alone in his headquarters, looking at maps that told him the war was already over.
He had seen it coming. Nobody had listened. And the men on that beach had paid for it.